You're listening to episode 30 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Our guest today, Dr. Patricia Jennings, speaks with us about her upcoming book, Mindfulness for Teachers: Simple Skills for Peace and Productivity in the Classroom. I have a prediction. In a different podcast than Present Moment, one of the guests suggested that mindfulness was on the way out, that it wasn't going to last. I have a different notion, however, and am going to double down on my confidence that mindfulness in some form is here to stay. My prediction is simple. In the same way that more traditional forms of yoga have become mainstream and are increasingly being taught in our K-12 educational system, so we shall see an increase in mindfulness programming in our schools, gaining ground that traditional religious contemplative education hasn't and shouldn't. Of course, that means growing the body of competent mindfulness teachers, who themselves need the resources to facilitate their students not just learning how to think, learning how to be. Dr. Patricia Jennings is the Senior Director of Contemplative Teaching and Learning Initiative at the Garrison Institute and is Associate Professor at the Curry School of Education, University of Virginia. Dr. Jennings received her doctorate in human development from the University of California, Davis, and completed postdoctoral training at the Health Psychology program at the University of California, San Francisco. She led the CARE faculty team in the development of Garrison Institute's Cultivating Awareness and Resiliency in Education, and she is conducting research to examine how CARE may improve student-teacher relationships, increase student pro-social behavior, a more positive classroom atmosphere, and improved student academic performance. In addition to psychological research, Dr. Jennings has over 22 years of research and teaching experience in the field of education. And our guest today is Dr. Patricia Jennings. Tish, welcome back to Present Moment.
Thanks, Ted. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very glad to have you here again. And we spoke with you in episode 23 on your CARE program, but today we're going to talk about your upcoming book, Mindfulness for Teachers: Simple Skills for Peace and Productivity in the Classroom. So tell us a bit about that. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, to be honest with you, I had this really great fortune to have Dan Siegel from UCLA actually recommend me to W.W. Norton. So they actually asked me to write this book.
Oh, it doesn't get much better than that when the publisher says, well, you write a book.
Yeah. And so a couple of years ago, they came to me, they said, we'd really like you to write a book about the work you're doing with teachers and mindfulness and teachers. Can you do that? And I had never written a book before. So I said, I'll try. So it took me a couple of years to write this book, but I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. And I have to give some thanks to my editors at W.W. Norton because they've been really helpful in helping me learn how to write a book.
So tell us a little bit about that before we go into the book itself. As a new author, the writing experience, what was that like for you in learning how to do that?
It was daunting because I drafted an outline and then I would start working on it, and it just felt like a huge, huge task. And what I came to, it was interesting. During the time that I was working on this book, or at the beginning of the time that I worked on this book, I did mindfulness-based stress reduction at Omega with John Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santorelli. So I had this great opportunity to study with them. And during that time, John Kabat-Zinn told us in that training that the way he wrote books was after he practiced his meditation, he would sit with his laptop on his lap and he would write. And I thought, wow, that's a great idea. So I started doing that. Every morning I got up a half an hour earlier than I normally would so that I had time to do my practice. And then I would sit with my laptop on my lap afterwards and let myself just write, not worry too much about what it was that I was trying to say, just let it flow. And I have to say that practice really helped my writing. And so I would allow myself this time to just let whatever was in my stream of thought come through, and then I would go back and edit it. And that worked really, really well. And then I had help from my editors. I would send them a draft of certain chapters, and then they would send it back to me. And I think the most challenging part of writing the book was transitioning my style of writing from an academic style into a more narrative style. And so that took a little while because every time I would write about this book combines information about the research with my own narrative as a teacher, my own experience as a teacher and a teacher educator. So my tendency was to shift from a narrative style into a more scientific sounding style. And it took me some time to even that out so that it was all narrative, because that's what they really were looking for. So telling the story of the research instead of reporting the research as a scientist, was an interesting challenge for me.
And that's very difficult for many scientists. And that's not a criticism. That's simply an acknowledgement of the world that academics and people who are in contemplative science do is very different than the narrative form. And in fact, there's an imposed and necessary separation of the narrative from the reporting of the science.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So it is, you get basically taught, that thou shalt write in the passive tense, and you must qualify everything you say with a may, this may be blah, blah, blah. So, instead of doing that, just telling the story of what happened in the research, like a story, I learned that's really makes it much more readable, rather than trying to report it like a scientific paper.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges that we face in general with contemplative science is communicating to the general public what this stuff means and what some of the things it doesn't mean, what some of the hype is around it.
Well, and I think one of the roles that I play, I found myself filling this niche, is I'm a good translator. I know how to talk to scientists. I understand the science. I can read the literature, but I can also talk to teachers, and I understand what teachers' concerns are because I spent many years myself as a teacher. So I know what their world is like. I know what their concerns are, and I know what they're interested in and what they want to know more about. So I think what this book does is it really bridges that chasm, brings the science of all of this, the mindfulness science, into the classroom, into the teacher's life, so they can understand how it applies to their life and their stress and their classroom and their students.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good way to characterize it, is that it's not a gap, it's a chasm today. And this is helping bridge that and make it more of a gap from the big yawning chasm it is today.
Yeah. I hope it fills that role, because it feels to me, as I think about a chasm, I feel like it's like a rope bridge. It's like a little thin rope bridge.
So the book itself, the structure, tell us about that. What's in it?
Well, the first chapter is a chapter about mindfulness in general. And the way I'm speaking of mindfulness in this book is very generic. I acknowledge that there are different traditions that define mindfulness in different ways, but basically I'm focusing on the very generic John Kabat-Zinn definition of mindfulness as non-judgmental present moment awareness. And I also explain very carefully how often you may be noticing that you're being judgmental, that's okay. That being aware of your judgmentalness, it's not like you're supposed to suppress your thoughts or suppress your judgments of yourself, but just notice that that's what's happening. And I explain why mindful awareness can be really helpful to teachers in their daily lives. And then the rest of the book actually builds that out, explores that more. When I started studying stress after being a teacher for 22 years, I started realizing that the classroom itself is a pressure cooker of stress. You're with 20, 30 kids, and they're supposed to be doing what you want them to do, and they're not supposed to be noisy or bothersome or interrupt you, but they do. And you're supposed to be in control, and you can't leave. So it really is a pressure cooker. And so noticing this, noticing the emotions that are sort of the emotional soup of the classroom, noticing your own reactions to that, your own sensations related to that, and being fully present for your students can make a huge difference, because the kids respond to adults differently when they're more mindful.
Yeah, and it helps you as a teacher be more responsive rather than reactive to what the kids are doing in the pressure cooker, being kids.
Exactly. So the first chapter talks about that, and then the next two chapters, the second chapter 2 and chapter 3, are really about emotions. So the first chapter 2, the first one about emotions, is really about the emotional art of teaching. It's about how our emotions actually can enhance our teaching, how whatever emotional valence that we express when we're teaching content can make a big difference in whether kids can learn or not. And so I talk a lot about how teachers can use their own emotions and how they can stimulate emotions in their students in ways that will help them learn better. And I talk a little bit about learning and emotion in that chapter. And then chapter 3, I talk about negative emotions, and I draw upon a lot of the work of Paul Ekman, and learning a little bit about what happens to your body and your mind when you're experiencing anger, sadness, fear, when you're basically in the midst of a fight, flight, or freeze response. What happens to your thinking, what happens to your physical sensations in your body, and how to notice those things before they escalate to the point where you can't regulate them anymore, those feelings.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you were talking about emotion and how that impacts the student's ability to learn. And I think back, as many of us can, to a good teacher we had, and what was it that made them good? And for me, typically it was their own passion and transparent excitement about what it was they were teaching, versus a teacher I didn't learn as much from or didn't have a positive experience with. And usually the common denominator with that was they were really not excited or happy or engaged with what they were doing.
Yeah, and sometimes when a teacher doesn't have that kind of enthusiasm for their content, they aren't necessarily always accurate with the way they teach either. So, like being excited about your content and teaching in a way that you enjoy is really important. And I think one of the problems in education today is that in many cases teachers are being kind of forced to follow certain types of curricula that they don't feel passionate about, because the schools are saying you have to teach this, you have to teach it this way. Teachers are not being given as much freedom and flexibility as they used to about how they teach and what they teach and how they deliver the content. And I think that can be a problem.
It's a difficult balance having a prudent and useful standard for teaching and still allow for creativity in the teachers so that their passion and enthusiasm can show and manifest.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So then the next chapter talks about positivity, and I draw upon Barbara Fredrickson's work a lot in that chapter and talk a lot about the effects positive emotion have on our well-being, our physiology, our ability to understand and learn, our connections with one another, our relationships, and building a community of learners. The other thing I forgot to mention is throughout these chapters about emotion, I really keep cycling back to mindfulness, because it's really about being mindful of this emotional experience you're having. And in that sense, you're able to have some mastery over it instead of it having mastery over you. And then the chapter 5 is called The Heart of Teaching. And this is really about building community in your classroom. And it includes activities related to compassion and empathy and understanding one another and helping students learn how to care about one another, to respect one another. Because when you can create a kind, caring community of learners, as a teacher, you don't have as many problems with behavior, with cooperation, because everybody wants to be part of this community. They want to contribute. that is a natural tendency that human beings have because it's been critical to our survival to be part of the community, to contribute to our community. So finding ways to create opportunities for kids, whoever they are and whatever their limitations are, to contribute in a positive way in the classroom. So I talk a lot about that and how mindfulness can help you notice those critical moments when you may be able to help somebody be a contributor rather than somebody who's disruptive. Throughout the whole book, there are stories that come from my own life as a teacher, but also stories that I've heard from teachers I've worked with about situations where they were more or less mindful or when emotions got the best of them and how it affected their classroom and their students. So it has a very narrative flow to it and a lot of stories.
And imagine that helps tell the story itself in that you're speaking with the voice from actual experience that teachers in particular reading this are going to resonate with. Oh, yeah, I've been there. I've done that.
Yep. I hope so. I think so. And then chapter 6 is called Orchestrating Classroom Dynamics. And this chapter was probably one of the hardest chapters to write. It's about classroom management. And I say classroom management because that's what we call it these days. The term classroom management implies that teachers have control and that they can control behavior. And that's why I don't like the term classroom management. And that's why I called it orchestrating classroom dynamics, because I feel like it's really more about conducting, orchestrating, like creating opportunities, opening spaces, creating flow. It's an artistry of creating physical and emotional and social environments that encourage people to want to contribute and also to want to learn and be engaged and excited and interested in learning. But it also goes into the nuts and bolts of what we know works in classroom management. So it's not as if I'm saying, okay, well, all you have to do is be happy and everything will be fine. I actually do talk about some tested methods of classroom management, but I talk about how mindfulness can really support what we already know about methods that work to help manage difficult behavior. I take teachers through some of these methods that, are time tested, but they only work if you're aware of what you're doing, is basically the story. And this is something that I learned from my experience as a supervising student teachers and observing them, because you can tell somebody, well, when this happens, when this student does this, the best thing to do is to calmly remind him and move whatever he's doing over to another table. That's just an example, right? Well, the reason why it works when they're calm is because students will respond to a very firm, kind direction. That's usually they'll just go, oh, okay, fine, But what happens is teachers often, the first thing they do is they start feeling irritated or annoyed, or they imagine that behavior is intentional, or they are just impatient, whatever it happens to be, they're irritated. And their voice doesn't have that calm, determined, this is what we do, kind of matter of fact quality to it. It's either whining or it's griping or it's complaining or it's nagging. And when kids hear that tone, they don't listen to what you're saying. They hear the tone. They immediately get resistant. They either, if their tendency is to be defiant, that will increase their defiance in that situation. If they tend to be kind of passive, they will just freeze, because they'll feel like you're picking on them. So what it takes is this sort of calm, collected, let's just be calm. This is the way we do things here in this classroom. There's no annoyance. There's no irritability. There's no crabbiness. There's no complaining. There's no whining. It's just, this is what we do. And kids listen to that. But the only way you can do that is if you're aware of how you're feeling, if you're aware of what you're saying and what the tone of your voice is. And that takes mindfulness. It's really, really helps. And so that's what I talk about in this book, is that there are these time-tested methods. They work really well, but they don't work if you're not noticing what your tone of voice is or what, how you're responding to the situation.
Yeah. And I think that's a key part of this is, as you said earlier, this is not about suppressing or avoiding what you're actually feeling. Of course, you're going to be irritated when a kid is being challenging, for example. But the mindfulness practice gives you the space to choose how you respond, that you don't go with that irritation, but you do take a moment and make a different choice in that moment.
You said that very well. The other thing you can do, because there are times when you might not, you might still feel frustrated and you still have to do something. So what I have found is that if you just are honest and say, right now I'm feeling really frustrated and I'm going to take some breaths and I'm going to calm down and then we can talk about this. That works really well because you're being honest. You're telling them you're acknowledging that you're not in the right state of mind to talk to them at that point. You're taking care of yourself. You're modeling self-regulation. You're teaching them that it's okay to feel frustrated, but it's not okay to say things that hurt other people when you're frustrated, and that when you're frustrated, what you need to do is take care of yourself, And so I talk to teachers in the book about that as an option too, if they're just so frustrated, because sometimes it's just, you can only do so much.
Right. And you used a key word there, model. And that's exactly what you're doing is you're embodying the behaviors that we'd like to see and acknowledging your own humanity. I also get frustrated and I need to do the same stuff that I'm encouraging you guys to do. I would imagine that the students, whether they're kids or adults, respond more positively to an acknowledgement of, yeah, I'm a person too. And this also helps me.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. When I was doing my research, not for this book, but for, other papers I've written, what's really interesting is teachers, we always we think that we're hiding our emotions from our students, that we think we're able to do that. We're not. The research shows that students do know how teachers feel. And they may not completely understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling. But when a teacher is frustrated or angry, they know, even if the teacher is trying to hide it or pretend that they're not. So being able to acknowledge it and just be honest about it, and then also model this other approach to dealing with those feelings works really well.
So something you were also talking about earlier is that this is something that is impactful in their daily lives. And I think that's a very important feature that may not always get the attention that it warrants, is that the practice isn't simply for something you do at work as a tool, an instrument you use during the workday, and then you go home and you can forget all about it. There's more to it than that this impacts your whole life, not just that part of it. Tell us a little bit more about that, because that impacts your intended audience for the book.
Yeah, I think this is really important because mindfulness isn't just about sitting on a cushion. It's really about bringing more presence and awareness and kindness and compassion into everything that we do, and being aware of the effects that we're having on the rest of the world. So for a teacher, teachers have a huge impact on the world. If you think about the number of children over the course of a career that a teacher can impact, it's really powerful. And those being more mindful in the classroom not only models the kinds of behaviors that we want our students to be exhibiting, but it also teaches them in a way to be mindful. Because I think this is just my theory. I don't know this, I've never studied this, but from my own experience as a teacher and a mindfulness practitioner, the more mindful I was as a teacher in my classroom, the more mindful my students were just naturally. I was teaching some mindfulness activities when I was a teacher to my kids, but the thing that was much more powerful teacher was just my own behavior and my own mindfulness as a model, as a presence. I think in a way, a mindful teacher can scaffold mindfulness for her students just by being present in that way. And kids gravitate towards it. They're attracted to it. They like the stillness and the calmness. They can get wild and crazy, but they also really like calmness, and they like the feeling of being connected with an adult who cares about them. They really do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was talking about this. What is it that we teach as teachers? What's the best way to do that with Catherine McLean, who's a researcher. And she said one of the things that really helps isn't so much the conceptual ideological stance or what the practice is itself, but that so much of what we get from our teachers is their own embodiment of it, their own presence of it.
I would agree. Because if an adult tries to teach kids any kind of mindfulness practice, and if they don't have a deep mindful presence themselves and they haven't embodied that fully, then it doesn't come across the same way. It can't be just transmitted by telling people to do something. There's a certain presence that needs to be there in order for it to be transmitted. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I admire most about the MBSR program, in particular their teacher training program, is fundamental to that. A cornerstone of it is a deep and long-standing personal practice so that has time to unfold and mature and be a noticeable component of one's ability as a teacher.
yeah, and it tends to reinforce itself because the more present you are, the more able you are to bring this mindful awareness into what you're doing, the more positive reinforcement you get because it really it improves efficacy. It's really amazing to me. I mean, I know there's all these arguments about instrumentality and mindfulness, but when you've had that experience of it really improving your effectiveness in whatever it is that you're doing, there's a power there. If you're doing good work and you're really trying to help people and this practice can help you do it better, I say, hooray, let's help other people better. I think it's really valuable. And it definitely, as the efficacy improves, then the presence grows and the embodiment grows. And then it's like it's a self-fulfilling process.
Yep, exactly. And let's talk about those yays a little bit. So in writing the book, doing the research, putting it together, what were some of those personal highlights and aha moments and rewards for you in doing that process?
Well, I was just thinking about the last chapter that I was going to tell you about, and it's the last chapter is mindfulness and school transformation. And this one was another one that was really hard to write. When I first had the idea, I thought, oh, that's a great idea, mindfulness and school transformation. And when I started writing, I started stumbling right away until I found this quote from Buckminster Fuller that I'll read to you because I think it really helped me understand how to pull this together. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I love that quote because that's really what I think about. We can't fix this old model. It's an old model. It just doesn't work. But what we can do is we can begin to create a new model by being the change that we wish to see, little by little, like teacher by teacher, school by school. We can slowly build this new model that is based in caring and compassion and kindness and helping people understand themselves better and be able to be their best rather than competition and judgment and criticism and a lot of negativity and a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and a lot of anger. That's what's going on in our schools today. And to me, I see the transformation taking place at the emotional level. Changing those emotions can make a huge difference in a school. That's a big transformation. It may not seem like, you haven't changed the building, but instead of a lot of very angry, anxious people, children and adults, what if we had a whole classroom full of very happy, fulfilled, caring individuals? It could make a humongous difference. So I think for me, that realization and that ability to articulate that was really rewarding because it can feel daunting. At the end of each chapter are descriptions of different kinds of practices that teachers can use to apply to so things like the basic focused attention practice, open awareness practice, loving kindness practice, walking mindfulness, eating mindfully, teaching kids certain kinds of activities that can be integrated into the classroom, things like journaling, noticing emotions and journaling around emotions. There's a lot of different activities in this book that teachers can do to apply this to their teaching.
And again, not just teachers, but just a lay practitioner who's interested in finding out more about mindfulness and how it applies in various settings.
I think that parents would really like this book because a lot of what I talk about really applies to parenting as well. Maybe that'll be my next book. A lot of people have been telling me they're going to buy these books for their kids' teachers, as gifts, because people are always trying to think about things to buy their kids' teachers for like holiday gifts. Anyway, that's just a thought. Somebody had mentioned that they were going to do that.
One of the things I wanted to mention is I liked very much the phrasing that you used, and particularly in the classroom when you were talking about it as being dynamic, that there is this quality of organic creativity in the moment as you build this community energy. And I think that's missed a lot in traditional teaching methods, that we see it in the MBSR program. That's what we're doing, is the sharing, and we're building that resonance with one another. We learn from each other. That's a key and wonderful feature of it, that if we can get that kind of thing in the classroom where, as you said, you have students who are contributors, they're not just consumers, that's huge. The classes that we all learn most from is where we were really on the edge of our seats, and there and participating, that's a hungry mind that has an appetite for what's going on. That's great. That soaks things up like a sponge.
I think this is really important, that being comfortable with ambiguity and chaos, because our learning is messy. Learning doesn't go in a straight line. It goes around in circles and spins up and down, and I think mindfulness helps teachers be more comfortable with ambiguity and craziness and those sorts of things, which, is really how kids learn.
Things are not always under our control, and that's okay.
Right.
It's not the end of everything. And in fact, that's a wonderful opportunity to build some resilience and strength in the chaos that is inevitable in life. For folks who are listening, you can find out more about the CARE program on the website care4teachers.org with the number 4. And I'll be linking to that on the episode page for this episode as well. And we'll also have a link to the book that we've been discussing on mindfulness for teachers, simple skills for peace and productivity in the classroom. As of this recording, it's not available yet, but you can pre-order it. And so you'll be able to do that right on the page. And one other thing, I would encourage the listeners to follow Tish on Twitter and Facebook, as she's one of the more active participants in social networking in the mindfulness discipline. So our guest today has been Dr. Patricia Jennings. Tish, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Ted. It was quite a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.